Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our fourth talk in our Maestro series. We're delighted to welcome on this November night the fantastic Christopher Tin. And of course, it's not a November night, it is a November morning where you are in California. I presume you're in California at the moment, Christopher.
I am, yes.
And we're delighted to welcome you along. So for those of you who don't know that much about Christopher Tin, we are going to enlighten you over this next hour. But as a blurb, I'm picking this from Christopher's website, just the first section, the first paragraph. Well, we're delighted to welcome a two-time Grammy award-winning composer of concert and media music. This music's been performed and premiered all over the world in many prestigious venues, including Carnegie Hall, the Lincoln Center, the Hollywood Bowl, Cadogan Hall in London. It's been performed by diverse ensembles as the Philharmonia Orchestra, the Metropole Orchestra, the US Navy Band, and he's also conducted his own compositions with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra and the Welsh National Opera Orchestra. It is quite an introduction, Christopher, and it's quite a distinguished career that you have achieved so far. But I'd quite like to start right back at the beginning in your childhood and just talk about for a little while your musical influences growing up. What composers did you listen to? Was it classical music? Was it a wide variety of musical genres?
It was a wide variety of musical genres. I mean, I think I was one of these voracious consumers of music. I think many of us are, right? I mean, of course, there's the bread and butter classical music. And for classical music, I tended to, gravitate towards romantic, late romantic, American 20th century music.
Yeah.
But I also was very interested in jazz. I was very interested in musical theater, pop music, folk, even world music. So I mean, there's just a lot that I was very, very hungry for at an early age, and that I think wound up sort of shaping my eventual sonic identity.
Yeah. So can you sort of trace those influences coming through in your modern works?
Oh, for sure. And I mean, the influences are far and wide. I mean, to use some of the more outlandish extreme examples, yes, I mean, obviously I was introduced by, things like classical and jazz, but
yeah,
I mean, my approach to making recorded music, albums and such was heavily influenced by, the British invasion, right? Like albums like Sergeant Pepper's or Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall or things like that.
Yeah,
Tommy,
we got quite a few fans in there. I'm sure they'd be pleased you saying that, definitely.
I mean, I was such an obsessive Pink Floyd listener all through my angsty teenage years. It's ridiculous, but it also approaches the way that I construct my albums. I mean, there's a certain cohesion and a flow and a narrative that I like to put in my music that you found in those sort of those huge Pink Floyd albums from the 70s, right? I mean, I was very into R&B, Stevie Wonder. I was very into blues, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Eric Clapton, Johnny Winter. I mean, the influence was far and wide. Musical theater. I mean, I loved shows like Jesus Christ Superstar, like early Andrew Lloyd Webber, for example.
Yeah, definitely.
Just into everything. Gilbert and Sullivan. I was hugely into Gilbert and Sullivan. So I mean, it's just a wide range of influence.
Fantastic. And I also, because a lot of your compositions focus on the video game industry, I just want to ask, what was your experience in video games growing up as a kid?
Playing them a lot. I mean, that's that you grow
Same
up and
here,
right. I mean, come on, like, we're of a generation. I'm of a generation that remembers when the first Nintendo Entertainment System came out in the 80s, and suddenly all of us kids were glued to the TV playing Super Mario Brothers, just obsessively, right? But also one of the game franchises that I was obsessed with growing up was actually Civilization, which was the franchise that it's the franchise I'm best known for in a sense, right? I mean, I played the original Civilization, and then years later, I was brought on to write the theme songs for Civilizations 4 and 6. So, I mean, in a way, it's kind of fun that my own childhood hobbies eventually led me into writing these theme songs for this iconic franchise.
And I'll come to that slightly later on. And there's another, it all the dots almost connect, because there's another link through your sort of teenage years and studying years with the Civ stuff. And I'll come to that later on. Do you have any video game soundtrack memories that spring to mind? Because obviously you're thinking the Nintendo Entertainment, that was your 8-bit era, where they're very limited on what they could actually fit into the memory for the music. So were there any early video game soundtracks that inspired you?
Well, I think, you hit it right there, in terms of game soundtracks. The earliest video games out there, they were very limited in terms of the sounds they could make, right? Nowadays, you can have any sort of music on a video game, right? But in the early days, it was really just very basic sine wave tones, basically. And so there was an emphasis on making the most out of those tones, because you don't have timbre, you don't have the sound of an oboe or a violin or a cello, right? So you really had to maximize what those tones could do by writing great compositions, right? Great melodies, great structure, great form, great harmony, all of that sort of stuff. And so, some of those earliest video games that, we probably grew up playing, I'm probably older than you. You look very young, but games that I played, Super Mario Brothers, Legend of Zelda, Koji Kondo scores, they were heavy on melody, melodic development, and frankly, just they were fun too. It wasn't so much about music just kind of creating a mood, right? It was also that the music was fun intrinsically. And I think in a way, I've always been a heavily melodic guy. I've always been about, your great core main melodic ideas, finding those and then developing those. I feel like developing a piece that doesn't have a great core melodic idea is just a waste of a piece in a way. Like you want something that has great hooks, great memorable melodies. Those iconic melodies are the things that last through time, right? Everyone to this day and age can sing the Super Mario Brothers theme, right? But you single out, compositions, and I'm not just talking about video game music, but film music, concert music, anywhere nowadays. The ones that don't have those signature tunes tend to sort of fall away into the dustbin of history, right? Even amongst the oeuvre of like a great composer like Beethoven, what are the symphonies that we remember? 9, 5, 6, 7, 3, less so with 1, 2, 4, what am I missing here? Anyway, point is, the ones that have the big iconic melodies are the things that sort of last throughout time.
Absolutely.
And that's how I approach music as well.
And I think a lot of that early video game music has sort of following on from the success of Baba Yetu and the video games live and that movement of orchestral video game compositions. The older ones, because as you say, they have that melody so strongly enforced in them, they then actually allow them to be performed by an orchestra and sound as vivid and as live as they did back in the 80s.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I subscribe to a philosophy that you hear discussed a lot in, say, the pop songwriting world, which is that a great song is one that can be stripped down to just a piano or like a piano solo or a piano and vocal. And you can get rid of all the fancy production, all the fancy instrumentation. If you could strip it down to its basics and it's still a great piece of music, then that's a great piece of music, right? But so much music that's written these days, whether it's, contemporary classical or whether it's pop music or other radio friendly genres of music, it's about production or it's about what's in style. It's about these sorts of things that I don't think translate in sort of a permanent sort of way. I like things that will, no matter who performs it, no matter how poorly or how brilliantly it's performed, no matter what instrument it's performed on, it will live on. And to me, the elements of great music that do that are things like melody and structure, right? Melody, a great tune will just live forever, right? And also structure, like knowing when to do what is such an important piece, an important part of writing music, right? making these smart decisions like, oh, I'm gonna do this now, and then I'm gonna repeat it or not repeat it. All these structural decisions are what really make a piece of music sit together, because the way that we consume music is comprehending its structure, like from start to finish, right? Like, when does a piece do what you expect it to do, and when does a piece diverge from the expectation? And that's what makes great music in my mind.
Yeah, so now we're talking about composition. That leads us nicely onto education and sort of your time at, obviously, first Stanford, and then Oxford, and latterly the Royal College of Music in London. I'd like particularly to talk about your time in London, if I may. And you came across a composer and worked with a composer called Joseph Horowitz, who I've come across him in the brass banding world, because he wrote a number of pieces for brass bands. But Joseph Horowitz is a phenomenal composer who his works are obviously still lived on and still performed now. What was that like to work with Joseph, and has that again shaped your compositional style or the way it's moving?
I think Professor Horowitz was he was the first person to I guess suggest to me that perhaps I should be like a ballet composer or something like that. He had this idea of narrative that's in a lot of his works that was really appealing to me. And the fact that he wrote music that wasn't modernist. It was still, at least the music that I know of his, his Sinfonietta and his ballets and so forth, it was still very much a continuation of that sort of romantic tradition.
Absolutely.
I think one of the things I learned from him was that, to be brave in embracing the sound that you were meant to create, in a way, right? It's very easy, especially in academia, to be sort of swayed to write in a certain style, to embrace modernism or spectralism or minimalism or postmodernism or any of these isms.
Be associated with the school of music.
Yeah, right. Whereas if you are sort of put on this planet to write a certain style of music that you are particularly good at writing, you should not deny your inner voice just so that you can try to appease this college professor or these gatekeepers of the classical institution. Or you should not try to necessarily be on the cutting edge if what you're not meant to do is if you're not meant to be on the cutting edge of the avant-garde. If what you're instead meant to do is to write great tunes, then why deny, what you're cut out to do, in a way? Doesn't mean you shouldn't be informed by what else is out there. Doesn't mean you shouldn't showcase your ability to write in other, genres, if that's the case, or if that's the necessity, right? It doesn't mean that you should be oblivious to all that. I mean, all of the developments that we've had in the 20th and 21st century in terms of contemporary classical music, they're incredible, and they're great to acknowledge and integrate when you can. But if the core of your music is something other than sonic innovation, then stay true to the core of your music.
Definitely. I think that's a really important message for sort of the younger composers who are studying, because again, it's finding that inner spark of creativity that comes from within, and ultimately that will, in any field of humanity, it's that inner spark and that creativity that leads to some of the greatest achievements. For example, we'll talk a bit later, but your JFKs of this world, people like that, it leads to a real creative society. So if I may move to your early days in professional composition, and you started off being an arranger for Silver Screen Records, and if I'm right in thinking, correct me if I'm wrong, but that entailed transcribing film scores by ear, and transcribing for those gents and ladies, this is transcribing a whole film score by just listening to it and moving stuff across into your own document. And and I've done a little bit of that for some projects. It is painstaking. It's listening over and over and over and over again. I mean, how did you find that as a sort of composer coming into music?
Well, I don't think there's any better education, honestly. I mean, it was a job that I got while I was at the Royal College of Music. They needed somebody to transcribe a bunch of James Bond scores, actually. And I had actually written a paper on the harmonic language of John Barry.
Oh, fabulous,
and so they referred me to the record company as somebody who could do this, because I had a good ear, and I could transcribe and I knew orchestration. In a way, there's no better training than to be given a recording, and then you sit down and you write down what you hear. And then another orchestra records based on what you wrote down, and you compare the two. And you say, "Oh my God, I totally made this mistake here. I screwed this up." Learning, the process of learning is making mistakes and then learning from them, right? That's how one truly learns. And so this is a great training ground for me. And it's also,
sorry.
That's okay. They gave me great music to listen to and transcribe. I mean, there were some contemporary film scores, people like John Williams and Howard Shore, but also classics, Korngold, for example, Max Steiner. I mean, you sit down and you obsessively listen to these recordings and you write down what you hear, and you learn so much about voicing and when to use certain instruments and how to voice chords and how to, what timbres are used when, and I mean, and balance. I mean, just, one of the best things about this exercise is figuring out by trial and error what dynamics to mark certain instruments at, so that they will balance against other instruments in the orchestra, right? Because on a recording that you get of a film score, I mean, the mix might have been sort of enhanced, or it might have been adjusted through post-production, right? But to make it reproducible with a live orchestra, that's a real challenge.
And I mean, in this country, we're very fortunate to have an absolute genius in John Wilson, who does the same sort of thing for these old MGM classical film scores, and then comes to the prom and these pieces come to life. It's a fabulous skill, and it really must have given you a lot of good experiences, obviously, to do scores like John Barry. It must have been exciting and eye-opening at that time.
It was fun. I mean, one of my favorite stories about doing the John Barry scores is that, they were James Bond scores, essentially, right? And the workflow that we had is I would transcribe them, and then we would take them over to Prague and record them with the City of Prague Philharmonic Orchestra. And there were some fun things that I learned. For example, the Bond fanfare, that, right?
Yeah.
We all know it in the Western democratic world, right? In the late 90s, going over to Prague, putting this music on the stands, I'd put the accents and everything right where they should be.
Yeah.
They just had no sort of cultural awareness of this fanfare. It's bong, bong, there was no like swagger and no sort of natural understanding of the James Bond vernacular. And the conductor turned to me and said, "This was a communist country. They didn't have James Bond movies, this wasn't just sort of like ingrained in their culture like it was in ours."
Wow. Again, it just I suppose goes to show how music and compositions can be interpreted totally differently by sort of two different orchestras or conductors or whatever. It's such a fascinating art of performance, and it allows you sort of as a conductor to find your own way through music.
It's true. It really is. Yeah.
So if I can move now to 2005. And Baba Yetu. Now this is where a friend of yours called Soren Johnson comes into play. Could you just tell us a little bit about how you came to meet Soren?
Soren was my old roommate when we both studied overseas at Oxford together. And at the time I was a music composition and English double major, and he was a history and computer science double major. And after college, we both went our separate ways. And then 5 years after our graduation, we went to our 5-year college reunion.
Yeah.
And we ran into each other. And he asked me what I was doing, and I said, "Oh, I've started working in film, writing music, ghostwriting, largely ghostwriting at the time." And I said, "What are you doing, Soren?" And he said, "I'm now a video game designer, and I'm designing Civilization 4 next." And as I'd mentioned before, Civilization is one of these game franchises that I grew up playing.
Because he did 3, didn't he?
He did 3 as well. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So, a couple of months later, he sent me Civilization 3. And by the way, I mentioned that he was a computer science major and a history major because that is the perfect combination of majors to be a designer for Civilization. If you don't know the game is actually about founding a civilization from the Stone Ages up until the modern age. And, you can develop technologies like the wheel and the alphabet. You can, conquer your neighboring civilizations. You can wage war. I mean, it's really a game about playing history. And so being a computer science and history major was the perfect fit for this game. Anyway, point being, he reaches out to me. He sends me a copy of Civilization 3. I play it. I love it. He says, we're working on Civilization 4 now. And what I've done is I've actually taken an old piece of music that you arranged back in college for your singing group, and I put it on the opening menu screen of our game. Wow. I know, right? And the entire development team loved it. And can we hire you to write a new piece of music? So that's the short version of the story. Wow. And it's one of these, that's a lucky break, right? But, it turned out the piece that I wrote for Civilization 4 was Baba Yetu, this song, which have you all performed it, or do you know of, or I mean, is it,
we have,
okay, right, okay, so I don't need to introduce it. And that was my first piece of video game music ever. It was my first entree into that world, and so I really wanted to do a good job writing a piece of music for it. And this is where all the influences that I had as a young musician came back into play. I mean, there was obviously my orchestral training from having written for orchestra a lot, but also transcribed a ton of film scores. But there was also my knowledge of world music. There was my knowledge of being a director of a college a cappella group that performed a lot of a cappella music. There was my experience with sort of what you call world music percussion, right? I used to play in a Japanese taiko ensemble, for example, and I knew all about large percussion. There was my experience as an a cappella arranger, writing for musical theater, for example. All of these things sort of influenced the way that I wrote this piece, which is one that leaned very heavily on vocals, was very dynamic in its modulations and its sort of like dynamic range, had a lot of like dramatic build-up sections. I mean, it was this thing where I really got to pour in a lot of my influences at the time.
Yeah. And so Baba Yetu becomes this incredible score for an incredible video game, and goes on to be performed in the Carnegie Hall, in the Lincoln Center, in the Kennedy Center by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, the Metropole Orchestra, BYU Men's Chorus, Angel City Chorale, and so many more. And fabulous Angel City Chorale, and of course it's then recognized classically with the Grammy. I mean, how did that feel at the time, that recognition?
I mean, really, really good. Like, I mean, kind of amazing. No, I mean, it was, I mean, to say that it's my signature song. I mean, it is, right? I mean, it's kind of what I'm best known for. I mean, the piece, I think it's one of these things where the moment you finish it, actually the moment I remember thinking, oh, I think I did something good here, is when I first played it for my friends, and they, two of my friends came over and they listened to it and they said, oh my God, you could just see the breaths being taken in, and I didn't know that it would go on to have the life that it did. I don't think anyone ever plans for that.
Because of course, bit of context, for the ladies and the gents at this point, a Grammy hadn't been won by a score for a video game, so it was the first score from a video game to actually win a Grammy, which had such historical significance for that industry, and has since gone on to launch the video game industry and the orchestral influence in the video game industry into just producing some fantastic scores.
Well, I mean, the video game music industry was already thriving, beginning to thrive when I wrote Baba Yetu. I mean, we were just starting to get these video game themed concerts, which turned out to be, you know, these big sellers for orchestras, right? I think what happened with Baba Yetu, and this is specifically a video game phenomenon, but the game industry was emerging from this world of just being considered sort of like silly kids entertainment to developing more sophisticated narratives and telling more, you know, like having more sophisticated art, telling stories and starting to stake its place as a playground for really creative people, right? And what you get a lot in the game industry is this psychology of wanting to be taken seriously, right? Gamers love when their chosen form of entertainment wins accolades and gets serious mainstream recognition, because it sort of validates their interests in a way. And this is one of these sort of things that gave game music the badge of being sort of legitimately taken seriously by the mainstream music industry. So it was one of these things that happened right at the right time, I think.
So from Baba Yetu, I mean, obviously, we're going to go on to talk about Calling All Dawns, but from when you wrote Baba Yetu to your next project, what was going through your mind creatively and thinking, what can I do next?
I mean, what was going through my mind at the time was one of, well, how do I capitalize on the success of Baba Yetu without suddenly becoming that African choral music guy, right? Who's actually not African at all, right? I mean, there was this sort of, you know, reflective sort of career assessment moment where it's like, okay, now what do I do? And I thought that, you know, the way to do this is let's take Baba Yetu and use it as the opening track for a new album, where each of the tracks is sort of like you know, touches on a different sort of non-Western vocal tradition, right? And that became the process of sort of like exploring all the vocal traditions out there, from Portuguese fado to Maori hakas, you know, to Indian Carnatic improvisation. You know, all of these sorts of things, it became sort of a research journey for me to sort of figure out what else is out there, and, you know, what can I sort of bring in under this large umbrella of music, and what sort of narrative can I put all of this under to make it all make sense. I mean, you know, like I said earlier, I was very into these concept albums of the 70s, you know, Sgt. Pepper and Tommy and so forth. And like, it was just a matter of coming up with this idea of like, how can I bring all of this together under one umbrella, make it musically unified so it makes sense, and just sort of like create something that's sort of a long form Baba Yetu in a way. And so that's when my album Calling All Dawns was born.
And as you alluded to there, you did write in Swahili, Polish, French, Persian, Maori. What was it like to write in all those different languages, and did the languages pose different challenges along the way? For example, I know if I'm writing I do a little bit of church writing. If I'm writing in Latin, for example, you sort of write it differently to English, and the stresses and placements different. Do you find that in other languages? Was it challenging? Was it fun, exciting?
Challenging, fun, and exciting. Yes,
Yeah.
It's all three. I mean, you know, the way I have to, you know, what I have to do. Fortunately, I live in Los Angeles, and it's a very diverse community here. So I can find a tutor in almost any language that I need a tutor in. And so sometimes it's a matter of finding somebody who speaks Farsi and saying, hey, I want a few lessons. And, you know, can we sit down and can you explain to me, you know, how these sounds work? You know, how where the stresses go in this poetry. You know, it's a lot of that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, fortunately, I went to a very diverse school, Stanford, and so a lot of my friends from Stanford, I mean, you know, they were Kenyan, they were South African, you know, they were able to help me with a lot of these things. And in cases where I just didn't have any sort of connection to a community member, I was just able to find someone online. I mean, what I've also done in subsequent albums, I've worked with a lot of dead languages, right? Even languages like Proto-Indo-European, which is this reconstructed root language that's sort of like the root language from which every other modern language springs, right?
Wow.
And of course, no one speaks Proto-Indo-European, but the more sort of obscure a language is, the more likely you're going to find a super eager professor at some university somewhere who's devoted his entire life to studying this obscure language and is so excited that somebody found him on the internet and he can sort of dump all his knowledge on this random stranger who wants to turn his you know, his chosen profession into art, right? So,
fantastic.
I mean, this sort of album couldn't have taken place in the days before Google or the internet, you know? I mean, it wouldn't have been possible for me to find all this and learn all this. I mean, it would have been very, very challenging. But you know, with the wonders of Wikipedia, I spent a ton of time on Wikipedia. You know, you can find a lot and learn a lot, and you know, with the wonders of the internet, you can find almost anyone you need to collaborate with.
Yeah, that's so exciting again, as you say. And moving to 2014, fast forwarding a little now, I am going to come to the latest album, but sort of before then, and your next on a major project, the drop that contained The Sea, and this was your first project. I'm right in thinking that was recorded in Abbey Road Studios.
Actually, Calling All Dawns was as well.
Oh, was it? All right.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. They all three of them have been.
Yeah.
But I mean, I do like working at Abbey Road.
Yeah. So I was going to ask just the experience of working in that iconic studio and obviously following the footsteps of the Beatles and those other famous names that have passed through those doors. What was it like? Did it feel as an iconic venue as obviously you think it is walking into it?
Well, yes. I mean, I think okay. So you know, the Beatles' influence is profound, and you know, I keep going back to the Beatles and Pink Floyd, right? But if you listen to the end of, for example, the Beatles' Abbey Road, that medley, right, from Golden Slumbers forward until the end. I mean, that sort of pace of interconnected short songs is the influence for the end of Calling All Dawns. Everything from, you know, Hayom Kadosh all the way to Kihora Te Marino, right? Same thing with The Dark Side of the Moon, you know, Brain Damage to Eclipse, right? I mean, it's that same sort of medley end that I sort of love on an album, right? Now, going back to the actual room of Abbey Road, yes, there's a lot of legendary recordings that are made in that room. I happen to be somebody who is very inspired by spaces. I remember the first time I stepped into the Royal College of Music, you know, through that marble entrance with the, you know, the statue and the column and that sort of stuff. You're like, you suddenly feel like you're entering someplace that's sacred and you want to live up to that space in a way, right? And going to the Royal College, it was like that. You know, you think about all the composers that went through, you know, Holst, Britten, Vaughan Williams. I mean, you know, like you just want to enter in that legacy and be a part of that, right? This idea of old sacred spaces with history is not something that Californians like myself experience very much. Every building around here is less than 100 years old, right? That's just the nature of living in a very young country. But you go to some place like England, like London, where the buildings that you step into, oh my God, you know, the people who walked in those halls, or the music that was written there, or the music that was recorded there, you know, there's a sense of history that inspires you very much. I was actually an architecture history minor too. In addition to being a music major, English major, I was also an architecture history, which made me the least employable person, you know, like in Silicon Valley, right? I grew up in Silicon Valley. Everyone else was joining Google and eBay and PayPal and all these companies straight out of college. I wanted to be a composer. But for me, the experience of space and visuals is very important, right? It just makes you, I don't know, just like want to rise to the occasion, I guess.
Yeah, that is. We are extremely lucky to have such venues in this country, and of course, my only hope now is that they stay open and can actually weather this storm, because we're in danger. Yeah, so that leads me really to the start of your latest album in 2016, which was the piece "The Dream of Flight," or Sogno di Volare, which takes the words of Leonardo da Vinci. And of course, this was another request by the Civilization computer game, and Civilization 6 this was, almost the spiritual successor to Baba Yetu. And I've got, just to explain a little bit, your taken from your sort of blurb about this particular piece, you were looking to capture the essence of exploration, both the physical exploration of seeking new lands, but also the mental exploration of exploring the frontiers of science and philosophy, which I think is profound. You can really hear that in the music. I certainly listened to the first two bars of the da 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 da, and it's almost a driving force, and you can feel civilization just moving forwards through the song. So for me, again, it has that air of the Baba Yetu, with history steeped on its shoulders. I mean, the Baba Yetu, the video in Civilization is just spine tickling, going from the caveman and looking at the cave paintings on the wall, and going right through Civilization up to space, and right back down to the man with a burning torch looking up at the stars. I think it's just such an evocative piece, and the same with this piece. It fits the bill of just being a piece for humanity, and appreciating the achievements of humanity.
I think that's a big part of what I'm actively interested in and excited by. I mean, I think this is a big part of me being an English major, actually, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, I there was a huge sweep of sort of canonical reading that I did, which I've since forgotten over the last 20 years. It's this interest, I guess, in humanism, and this idea that like there is a sort of a stirring heartbeat within our humanity that drives us to do things and accomplish great things. And there tends to be this sort of like embrace of the optimistic side of humanity. I think in this newest album, especially as 2020 wore on, I think, thematically speaking, I sort of embraced that more and more, like the importance of reassurance, of finding our own faith in our own abilities, and belief that we can actually do things. And I mean, I think that's why lately the climactic finale of my newest album, which is a setting of John F. Kennedy's moon landing speech, has taken such importance in my mind. We've just been through a very troubling, difficult U.S. period of politics and also friction and tension, right? And what was great about America in the 60s is that we were actually very united, to the point where in 1962, John F. Kennedy could say, hey, you know what we're going to do? This is crazy. Bear with me, but we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him back alive. And this was an amazing thing. And bear in mind, we had no idea how we were going to do this at all. We did not have the science or the know-how or the engineering or anything to accomplish this. But he said, guess what? We're going to do this before the end of the decade, right? That sort of vision is staggering to me, when somebody can just say, this is what we're going to do. And the American public, because they're so unified, can say, yes, we're going to support this crazy idea. It's crazy, it's crazy, it's crazy, but we're going to do it. And we believe that we can do it. And we did it, right? So what a moment in history that was. It was truly a moment where the entire eyes of the world were fixated on this. I mean, this is one of these things where, you know, I didn't quite realize, because I wasn't living at the time, just how momentous a world event it was until I was watching The Crown on Netflix. And there's this episode where Prince Philip is glued to his TV and he's just obsessed with this moment. And, you know, it just really dawned on me that everyone from, you know, royalty to the common man just was fixated on this moment, just to see, you know, oh my God, we did it. We left our planet. We flew. And what an amazing moment that was. And it was a moment where, you know, it reminds me in this day and age that, like, when we actually work as, you know, a united people rather than warring factions, we can do the difficult things.
Definitely.
You know, we can tackle the difficult challenges, you know, the hard ones, not the easy ones, as John F. Kennedy says in his speech. We can do the hard things. Because they're hard, we're going to do them. And that's just a moment that I just look forward to us as a people, not just Americans, but as a global community, getting back to, you know, one where it's not so divisive, one that we're all sort of like working together to solve the big problems.
Completely. And you can really hear that in the music that that you write, that feeling of hope and humanity. I do completely agree with the feeling of the moon landings. For me, it was early this year when Bob and Doug went up to the International Space Station, and SpaceX actually produced the first privately owned shuttle to the space station. And obviously the thrill for me watching it on my laptop, and it was sort of 8 o'clock at night here, and 10 o'clock at night this little craft had done a once around the world, and it was coming back, and I saw it out the window going past. And for me, that was that moment of, it's there, they're actually going up to the International Space Station, and ultimately that unites us. Everybody looks up and sees the night sky wherever they are in the world. They see it, and there's always been throughout history that sense of something greater, and reaching and exploring into newer frontiers. And I guess really that is the driving force behind your new oratorio, and the people you have included. Just to give a brief introduction to those who may not have listened, it's an oratorio which has each obviously starts with the Dream of Flight, the Sogno di Volare, which is Da Vinci, and then it has 11 different sort of inspirational speakers and doers of this world. Your Copernicuses, your Saint Hildegard von Bingen, Jules Verne, JFK. It talks about the Daedalus and the Icarus, who flew too close to the sun with his wax wings, and so looking at all those stories, how did you decide which of them to use? What was the creative process? And I think, to ask another question before that, almost the chicken and the egg, which came first? Did the Dream of Flight, the Sogno di Volare, come first, or did the oratorio come first?
Sogno di Volare came first. I mean, that piece was written, as you had mentioned, commissioned by the Civilization people as their new theme song. You know, that piece came about because you know, they showed me a picture of the menu screen, which was sort of this sort of you know, these sort of Renaissance era maps of the world, right? Animated maps of the world. And they told me, you know, the emphasis on this game is one of exploration. So I thought, okay, this is great. I actually took I found that Leonardo da Vinci quote, and it seemed perfect for the song. And so I based it on that, right? And the quote is, for once you have flown, you will always walk with your eyes turned skyward, because that is your home and that is where you long to return. And that became the basis of that piece. So like I did with Calling All Dawns and Baba Yetu, I said, okay, I have this piece now that's gained an audience. what can I do to expand it to a full release? And the idea dawned on me that I should do an album about the history of flight. And so, like you mentioned, 11 of aviation's pioneers are represented. Leonardo da Vinci, Hildegard von Bingen, Daedalus and Icarus, Dante, Copernicus, Jules Verne, Ferdinand von Zeppelin, Amelia Earhart, Robert Oppenheimer, Yuri Gagarin, and John F. Kennedy. 11 movements, and that number is symbolic of the Apollo 11 mission, right, where we actually put a man on the moon. But it's not just about pilots and cosmonauts and astronauts and the people who actually achieved this. It's not just about, you know, the Wright brothers and their first flight, or Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic, whatever. The idea of flying through the centuries meant more than just being in the sky. It meant things like being closer to the heavens, being closer to God, right?
Yeah.
And that's why you have the writings of people like Hildegard von Bingen represented, you know, when she says, you know, who are these who fly closer to celestial things? You know, or you have, for example, Dante. Like, on one hand, you have Copernicus, who actually mapped out the heavens for us, right? He put the sun at the center of the universe. He was the one who, you know, really popularized the heliocentric model of the galaxy, or the solar system. Sorry, but you know, on the other hand, you have the sort of the spiritual flip side of that. Dante, who I consider sort of the spiritual map maker who mapped out heaven and hell for us, right? So it's more than just, you know, like I said in that interview about Sonia de Bellari, it's more than just the physical exploration. It's also intellectual and spiritual exploration, right? It's more than just physically conquering the sky. It's also sort of like mentally and spiritually conquering the sky. And that's why I spend a good deal of the album talking about sort of the spiritual dimension of being heavenward.
And I really hope it can inspire people to almost find their own we will get to the moon moment in life, and almost inspire their life choices and their path in life. And obviously it's an oratorio, and it's been performed by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, the Royal Opera Chorus. With in the album, you've got Daniel Danielson and
Penne Patti.
I was wondering how to say it. Penne Patti. So that Daniel opera soprano, Penne is an opera tenor. You've got modern medieval in there. Hints of, obviously, with the Hildegard von Bingen, hints of the medieval plain songwriting. You've got Pembroke College Girls Choir and Anna Lapwood as well. So that was the performance. If you have a listen, it's on Spotify. It's on iTunes, presumably, as well, Chris.
It's everywhere. Yeah.
So go and have a listen to it, because it is absolutely fantastic. But going back to that point about people finding their own we shall get to the moon moment, do you have any plans for other performances of this? I mean, obviously it's been set back a bit, but were there plans in the pipeline for performances, or are there any in the future? Where's this sort of album heading?
It was due to have its world premiere in Washington, D.C. in August with the U.S. Air Force Band, actually.
Wow.
But then that got canceled because of the pandemic. And, you know, everything's been canceled since then. I mean, I think it's a monumentally massive piece. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's sort of like on the scale of a Carmina Burana or a Holst Clemens, right? It's a moderate-sized orchestra, but the vocal forces are immense. And there's actually a giant pipe organ part in it too, right? So, I mean, you know, if anyone knows someone at the proms who could program this, I mean, that's the ideal setting for something like this, right? But, you know, the point is, I guess, yes, I do want it to be out there in the world, but I mean, realistically speaking, we won't be able to book something. And by the time the world opens up and everyone's back to performing their concerts, I mean, I'll probably have another album out by then, right? So, you know, let's see what happens. I do hope that it gets some performances. I mean, it was written very operatically, as you sort of alluded to. I mean, opera is an interest of mine, you know, a very big interest. And it's a world where I started having conversations about writing my first opera with some leading American opera companies. And then the pandemic shut everything down, right? Which is very frustrating. But I do have some ideas for operas that come from the historical fantasy world that also do with things like great leadership. You know, these are things that I'm actively interested in exploring. And like you alluded to before, you know, I think what's great, what music can do better than most any other art form is it can inspire people to do great things, right? Music is not necessarily the format for delving into the nitty gritty of you know, intellectual ideas or telling stories on a very, you know, like, you know, conceptual level, you know, but what music can do very well is inspire people and move people. And just, it has this sort of like direct tap into people's emotions. And, you know, if I can have any sort of contribution to society long after I'm dead, I do hope that maybe somewhere along the line, my music can inspire someone to do something that's actually, you know, pretty great, right? I mean, I would love that to be my contribution, you know, that maybe some great leader somewhere, some great visionary, or some great thinker was perhaps spurned to do their great things by listening to a piece of mine amongst others, right? I mean, that's just what music is good for, inspiration.
Oh yeah, definitely right. Yeah, alluding back to performances of the oratorio, we are coming up to our 100th year in 4 years' time, and I mean, what better way to celebrate that than performing to Shiver the Sky? I mean, it will be amazing. I will be back in touch about that, no doubt. Watch this space, but I thought I'd get that one in. Yeah, it's an exciting time for the choir as well. Definitely.
Super. That's wonderful.
Yeah. So to completely
100
years. Yeah.
Your choir is older than most buildings in America. You know that? Like that's just amazing to me.
Yeah, it's I mean, we're looking to appreciate and celebrate the heritage that has gone before with the founder Fred Tomlinson. Took the choir to many great victories at Llangollen Eisteddfod in particular, and I'll come to that in a moment. And his son Ernest Tomlinson, who was a composer, a well-known composer in Britain. But you know, we're very excited to put a year of programming and just keeping our fingers crossed that we can do so in 4 years' time. But I want to just switch now from the oratorio, and of course you can find Christopher Tin on Facebook and all Instagram, Twitter, all of social media, his YouTube channel. There are tons of videos on there, and Spotify. So if you are thinking about having a listen and buying his latest album, then please do, and follow him on social media, because I know I do, and the gents in the choir certainly do, and we're all so looking forward to hearing more of your new compositions. And gents, please do watch out. We will be doing Sonore di Volare at some point to follow on from our Baba Yetu journey. So to move forwards, I do want to briefly talk about your experience with S4C, which is the Welsh TV channel. And I mean, the Welsh, I'm half Welsh, and we do appreciate our music. And you're sort of a celebrity on S4C because you've done such a lot of work with the Cor Cymru and of course the Llangollen Eisteddfod. And just for those who are perhaps unknown here, Christopher was an adjudicator on the Welsh Cor Cymru, which is the choir of the year in Wales. A very prestigious competition for the Welsh choirs. I know they love their music, they love their choirs. Firstly, what was that experience like? And secondly, what do you look for in choral adjudication? What do you look for in a performance?
Well, the experience of being a judge on Cor Cymru was a lot of fun. I mean, it was amazing. And the quality of the vocal talent was astounding to me. I mean, you know, these amateur choirs, some of them school choirs, some of them just choirs made up of like shepherds, you
Mm.
know,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
that had to, you know, work around the lambing season to be on this show, right? I mean, it was just mind-boggling how good all of these singers were just across the show. It was great. What I look for in a group is of course all the technical things. You know, I'm a very technical guy. I mean, essentially a significant portion of my career is being a record producer for my own records. And so there's a lot of the, you know, the basics that I look for: intonation, blend, you know, pitch, you know, all things. I mean, just the basics. Can you still hear me? Did I cut
Yes,
out?
I can. No, you're
Okay, you
fine.
can. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I mean, but on the other hand, you know, I also look for, you know, a certain spirit that the singers bring. That was in no short supply on a core company. I mean, you know, the choirs, you got the sense that everyone knew what they were singing. I mean, the technical stuff was very rock solid the whole time. Frankly, the decision-making process was very, very difficult at times. And there were a lot of times when the judges were split because some of us like this group and some of us like this group. I mean, I think that amongst all the musical arts, singing is the one where, you know, the life of the performer translates the best, you know. I mean, there is, you know, a lot of the other sort of instrumental arts, you know, you know, if you're a pianist playing a recital, it's a very introspective sort of thing, and you're welcoming people to peer into your introspective world. Not the case with singers. We are directly communicating to our audience with no boundaries in front of us, with no instrument to hide behind. This idea of communication and activating your audience is one that I think singers are particularly good for. And so I tend to place a little extra emphasis on that.
Definitely. And one final question, because I know we are approaching the end of the hour. It's flown by. I mean, it's been the most fascinating conversation. But just to finish on, you alluded a long time ago about your experience at Oxford, I think it was, and conducting the a cappella music. But what is your experience with choral singing? Be fascinating to know.
I sang in a choir starting in high school. I mean, I think it's one of these things where all the girls in my school said, "We need tenors.
Yeah.
Can you please join choir?"
Yeah.
There are a lot of girls there, you know, join choir. And that's what I did. And I think, you know, that's where I was sort of given the basic understanding of, you know, the particular needs that choral singers have, you know, the particular logistical challenges. And like, you know, you mentioned before, when I was in college, I took over the direction of a cappella group that performed a lot of African music. Actually, that was the bread and butter of this particular cappella group.
Okay.
So that's where I get my knowledge of African gospel music from, actually having performed a lot of it in my college group. And that really shaped the way that I write, not just for voices, but for instruments as well. I have a very sort of horizontal mode of thinking, if that makes sense. Like, I don't necessarily think in terms of vertical block structures, you know, one here and then the next one and the next one. I think about lines and how they move around. And, you know, that leads me to being a very contrapuntal composer as well. You know, I think the fine art of counterpoint has been lost on a generation of young composers. Either, you know, the generation coming up writing media music never went to school and never learned to properly write 18th century counterpoint, or the generation of very academically trained composers, you know, they left behind counterpoint alongside leaving behind the basics of functional harmony and, you know, tonality and things like that. The fine art of writing tonal counterpoint is something that I'm very much, I love. You know, I love to write a good counter melody. And when you write a good counter melody, sometimes that counter melody becomes the main melody of another theme or another movement. And that's why a lot of my pieces wind up having this sort of like woven together aspect of them, where something that you may have heard a germ of in one movement suddenly comes back as a full-blown idea in another, right? So that's how I like to approach composition now. And that is very much informed by my 3 years. There's only 3 years singing in choirs, but that's very much what I got out of the experience.
Yeah. Well, Christopher, it's been such a wonderful talk. It's been insightful, and I've learned so much. I mean, I've always followed your compositions along with Baba Yetu and this latest oratorio, but oh, by the way, just to mention the soundtrack for Off-World Trading Company as well, because I haven't really touched upon that. Ladies and gents, you must listen to that one, because it's, for me, it's just so, it's quite different. The video game is obviously it's looking at exploration of Mars, but it's sort of an economic twist, and I can it's, the soundtrack really feels like it underpins. It's like watching The Apprentice for me. You have that soundtrack underneath it, that sort of style. So I really enjoyed listening to that one as well. And you must, ladies and gents, listen to that. The Off-World Trading Company video game, the soundtrack. It's phenomenal again. And the solo, the piano stuff is phenomenal. But just an aside there. But it's been such a great opportunity to chat to you, and I know we've all enjoyed it so much. So thank you for giving up an hour of your valuable time. And obviously, look, best of luck in the future, and best of luck with your music work and your composing and performances. And we just keep our fingers crossed that the music industry can overcome the hurdle and get back to being a real creative player in society.
That's what we all aim to do, right? Be a benefit to society in a way, right? Thank you very much for having me. I hope to attend your performance of To Shiver the Sky in a few years. So, you know,
delighted.
Great meeting you all.
Yeah.
And thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Lovely to speak. Take care, Christopher.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.